Thank you again for joining us today. I'm going to be speaking about challenges in developing distributed energy projects in Asia. My definition of distributed energy is pretty broad. It's really small-scale projects that may or may not be connected to the grid, depending on exactly what they are, but are all clean energy projects. But, the first thing I think to note is that the market here is basically unlimited. There is just an enormous amount of work to do. We need 55 gigawatts of renewable energy in Asia, and we've got almost none. So from a scale perspective, you can just see the extent of work that needs to be done. At the same time, the frameworks currently are in the way. The systems are not really working. I'm going to focus on 4 countries in a bit: India, Thailand, Indonesia, and the Philippines. And you'll see that with the exception of Thailand, where they're sort of working, in the other 3 countries, we really don't have the tools that we need to scale up renewable energy to the level that we need it to get to. Very, very importantly, one word missing from this morning is the word health. Clean energy is actually not only about the environment, but about the health of individuals. I'm going to come back to this topic in a moment. And for this part of the world, it's critical to the health of millions and tens of millions of future Asian citizens. Now, what's the current situation? Let's put renewable energy in context for a moment and the challenges that we face to even get our renewable projects off the ground in perspective. First, fossil fuel subsidies are out of control. Worldwide, these represent, according to the IMF, $2 trillion a year. So that's $2 trillion moving from the economy into the fossil fuel industry every year. If you think about it from a renewable energy perspective, global subsidies for renewable energy are about $60 billion a year. So in effect, not material compared to fossil fuels. And we have to compete against that, and that is very difficult. In addition, when you look at Asia, I'm not sure if you can see this table you'll see that the amounts of billions of dollars that are being spent on fossil fuel subsidies in many poor countries is just unjustifiable on really any standard. But that's what we have to deal with. In addition, we see that notwithstanding what we already know about the impact of fossil fuels on the planet and health and people and what have you, the banking system, as I've written in an article, have their earplugs on and they're just not listening. There are billions of dollars that are still going into coal every year, especially in Asia. There's also no clear carbon price. It's very difficult to function in an environment where there's no carbon price because, in effect, the side effect of the traditional energy mix is just not priced in. Whereas for renewable energy, every side is already priced in. So when you've got that mismatch in pricing, in effect, you have additional subsidies that are being provided to traditional energy. Now, moving into more specifically some of the distributed energy challenges, and starting with the Philippines, I think as was noted before, it took a long time to get the renewable energy framework off the ground. The process is, let's say, can be improved. From a support perspective, it's not ideal, just the dynamic that was created in the Philippines specifically because of the first come, first serve basis. And there's no certainty, we have no visibility on what happens after 2015. The policies, like everywhere else in the world, are biased to existing energy systems. And finally, there are fundamental financial issues in getting deals done in the Philippines, and that have to do with how the renewable energy framework fits in with the financing. That basically means that you have to pay for 100% upfront out of equity and then hope you'll be able to refinance it, whereas in a traditional energy project, up to 60% or 70% should be coming from the banking sector. If you then look at Indonesia, I would say broadly speaking, the situation is even worse. And it's even worse because they don't have a standardized PPA process. The renewable energy support for projects larger than 10 megawatts is also not standardized. They've got conflicting policies between what happens on a provincial level and on a national level. They've got a monopoly power company that's got an enormous amount of bargaining power. And the result of all that is you hear about a lot of renewable energy projects outside geothermal probably in Indonesia, but they're just not getting done and they're not getting off the ground at the speed and at the scale that we need them to. India, again, lots of issues with their power purchase agreements. In effect, a Western investor just cannot bank an Indian power purchase agreement. That means that billions of dollars of financing are just simply not available for India. Now, you have to remember that in India, 700 million people have limited access to energy, and 400 million people have no access to energy. So, if you just look at the administrative barriers from that perspective, they're, quasi-inexcusable. They also have renewable energy credits, so they have a form of support for what we do, but it doesn't basically work because it's not enforced and it's not executed properly. And I could go on, but maybe I'll leave some of that for the Q&A in a moment. And finally, Thailand. Thailand actually works. Notwithstanding the current political situation, which is putting a lot of projects on hold, so there's been a slowdown, by and large, the Thais offer a pretty good model for India, Thailand, and Indonesia to emulate in terms of getting renewable energy seriously off the ground. But of course, like in any country from the United States to Germany to elsewhere, we can do much, much, much better than that. Because the fossil fuels, in effect, remain subsidized, because carbon is not priced in, and because administrative barriers remain at all sorts of levels. Now, what are the consequences of this atrophy, of this situation? I think the first consequence is, as is pretty well documented, Asia is basically set to roast the planet, in the sense that there are more than 1,000 coal plants being planned. Most of these are in China and India. And if they were to be built, they would lock in coal infrastructure for 50 years. If that coal infrastructure is locked in for 50 years, and if anybody pays any attention to the scientists and what they're telling us about the impact of that, then basically we might as well all just pack and go home. I want to come back to health just briefly. I think it's it's very important to keep in mind that 5 million deaths per year are related to climate change in some form of or another. And that's probably an understatement because there's a lot of pushback on what constitutes climate change and a lot of lobbying dollars, in effect, diluting the message. At the same time, you have tens, if not hundreds more of millions that are at risk, especially in this part of the world. And to give Bangladesh as an example, it's well documented that in Bangladesh, 15% of the country is going to be inundated pretty soon, and up to 20% of the population is going to be displaced. This is a great map which was put together to illustrate what happens if the polar ice caps melted and whether your city, in effect, will survive if they did, which on current trend they will, and which the coal build-out in Asia guarantees, in effect. And you can see from the next slide a very strange map of Southeast Asia and India, taking into account the coastal impact of all this. Now, what do we do about it all? I think we have to communicate and act. Climate change, at the end of the day, according to the Americans, is the biggest public health issue we face. So I'm not actually alone in this view. It's also a human rights issue. And that, I think, is going to make its way into the courts to try and get some action going. We need to remove administrative barriers, as you know, some of which I've described before. We have to ensure consistent and predictable renewable energy support, because when you look in detail at the Asian countries, it basically does not exist. And finally, we need to level the playing field. We pay for climate change twice, because on the one hand, we subsidize fossil fuels, and then we have to clean up after that. And it's far cheaper to replace all that with feed-in tariffs. And if you move that wall of money into renewable energy, many of the problems would disappear, because renewable energy suffers from a fundamental problem, which is an incredible lack of research and development dollars. Thank you.